The Outcomes Measurement Web is a series of topics organized in such a way as to serve as a self-guided tutorial to discuss major concepts and technical terms associated with measuring and managing treatment outcomes. We've tried to make the information on this web accessible enough to the average clinician, or clinical manager, or administrator, with no particular background in statistics, but with an active interest in learning about outcomes measurement. We also want to provide information that's deep enough with references to published literature and some of the more technical documents that'll deal with statistical methodology. I'll draw your attention to a couple of the topics that I think will be of particular interest, starting with the topic entitled Measure What and Why. We've worked with a number of organizations now for several decades, and one of the most common mistakes an organization can make is that they'll have the idea that they need to start measuring something, so they'll start talking and looking at various outcomes measures, and so they choose some outcome measure to use. What they end up measuring is dictated by whichever outcome measure they ended up choosing, without having really thought about what they wanted to measure, and particularly why they wanted to measure. Now, some organizations really are measuring to evaluate. That is, they want to show that their treatment works. So they design a study where they do a pre-post evaluation. And when you're doing that, you only need to measure at the beginning and at the end. And there is a role for that if you want to demonstrate that, yes, we provided effective treatments at one point in time. However, if your purpose is really to improve care, you need to approach the measurement differently. In that case, you are measuring much more frequently, and you're using the information as it comes in to inform the clinical process. This is what many of us refer to as outcomes-informed care. You're not simply measuring to evaluate. You're measuring in such a way that the measurement becomes a part of the treatment process. This opens up a variety of methods and tools that you can use to improve outcomes for your organization. The topic Global Distress Factor refers to the fact that in mental health care, the adult measures that have been most widely used have a very strong correlation. Through psychometric analysis of very large samples, we see that all the items are loading on what's called a global distress factor. In fact, it's hard-pressed to say that there's a factor for depression or a factor for anxiety. For example, I draw your attention to this 1998 article by Ensedal, where they literally factor-analyzed results from the Beck depression and anxiety inventories, and found that they were highly correlative. Reading from the abstract here, the parameter estimate was very high, 0.784, and a unidimensional single-factor model of negative effectivity approached the criteria for good fit, and it was concluded that the Beck anxiety and depression inventories assessed distinct anxiety and depression phenomena to a limited extent when used in clinically depressed sample. What this means is that we can actually design more efficient questionnaires. We don't need as many items because we realize that these items are all loading on a common factor. So you can have a questionnaire measuring a global distress factor with a very high reliability, comparable to much longer questionnaires, with a reliability of better than 0.9, without having to use a large number of items. This brings us to our next topic here, items or questionnaires. One of the difficulties of working with copyrighted proprietary questionnaires is that they're great if the questionnaire measures exactly what you want to do, exactly the way you want to do it, and you don't want to change anything. They're also good if you're an organization without access to a lot of data. You can't validate questionnaires on your own or test the psychometric properties. But the trade-off is a loss of flexibility. So one of the purposes of creating the ACORN questionnaires and the ACORN item inventory is that we wanted to have a pool of items that we could work with that had known psychometric properties and were well tested. This gives us the flexibility of putting together questionnaires tailored to meet the needs of the organization and the purpose of the measurement. For example, an organization treating a high number of patients with severe and persistent mental disorders may want questionnaires that are more tailored to severe symptomatology. There are some items that are more appropriate to that population that wouldn't be very useful in a general outpatient population. Alternatively, an organization providing EAP services and services to employees who would want to demonstrate the value of these services may not want items loaded for severe services, but more appropriate for the kinds of problems they see, and in particular, items intended to measure changes in productivity, since they want to be able to demonstrate to the employer the value of the services and that the forms have improved productivity. So by using the ACORN item inventory, we're able to put together questionnaires tailored to these needs. And since all of these questionnaires share a core of well-tested items that are used across multiple questionnaires, it's possible to equate these questionnaires and to make comparisons from one organization to another while retaining the flexibility of having alternate versions of the questionnaires. This is a huge advantage to organizations that are really interested in a sophisticated measurement approach. No more questionnaires than are necessary to achieve adequate reliability of 0.9 or better and validity, while at the same time not taking any more time than necessary. To find that optimal balance between the time it takes to collect the data and the usefulness of the data. So this gives you a start. There's a discussion here on reliability and validity, measurement concepts, and measurement error, working up to even the more advanced topics of meta-analysis, case mix adjustment, how do we equate and how do we benchmark outcomes across multiple sites where the mix of diagnosis and patient types are different, and working up to the idea of optimizing value in the rational allocation of resources. That is, we are giving services to the patients most in need of the resources because if we do that, these are the patients who will most likely improve, at which point for every dollar that we spend, we're getting more change for the dollar. Ultimately, this all leads up to the idea of value and value index. Not only are we then reporting what the outcome is, or how much improvement we get, but we're looking at what is our bang for the buck. When we go back to our employer or health plan, how do we show what they got for the dollar spent? And how do we demonstrate the value of the clinician? Since we know that clinicians really are what drive the outcomes, effective clinicians are really high-value clinicians. One of the things that the Acorn tools are designed to do is help high-value clinicians, 1, optimize their value, use the tools to improve their outcomes, and ensure that the patients most in need of treatment are getting it. And 2, to make the case to the payers, employers, and referral services for the value of the clinician's services.